speakers were Sir David Cannadine, Professor Ali Ansari, and Professor David Reynolds. This evening, we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Professor Margaret MacMillan, who is currently Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University. Most importantly, she was the warden of St. Anthony's College from 2007 to 2017, and you have a number of proud alumni here this evening in the audience. Margaret is also a trustee of the Imperial War Museum and has received numerous honorary degrees and awards, including being chosen by Queen Elizabeth and made a member of the Order of Merit by King Charles in 2022. Above all, Professor MacMillan is a world-class historian, focusing on the British Empire in the 19th and early 20th century and on international relations throughout the 20th century. She's published numerous articles and her books have enjoyed wide success. These include Woman of the Raj, Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World, which has won numerous national and international book awards, Nixon in China, The War That Ended Peace, The Uses and Abuses of History, and her most recent work, War, How Conflict Shapes Us, which Margaret is happy to autograph for you after this session. I just want to read what one reviewer said about Professor MacMillan, because I think it captures how fortunate we are this evening. Margaret MacMillan is that wonderful combination, an academic and scholar who writes well with a marvelous clarity of thought. She writes prose like an Audi, hurrying smoothly along the diplomatic highway. Tonight, she's going to talk about Churchill and the Grand Alliance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Margaret.
Well, I've never driven an Audi and I wouldn't dare try, but thank you for that. And thank you for that very kind introduction. I wish you hadn't listed my predecessors this year because they're a formidable bunch. All of them extremely good scholars. So I'm honored to be in their company. I'm going to talk tonight about Winston Churchill and the Grand Alliance in the Second World War, to which he devoted so much of his enormous energies and talents, because it was, as he recognized, absolutely critical, both for the war itself, but for the survival of Great Britain. Some years after the war, Dwight Eisenhower, who knew a lot about alliances, wrote of the ineptitude of coalitions in waging war. And he went on, even Napoleon's reputation as a military leader suffered when students in Staff College came to realize that he always fought against coalitions and therefore against divided councils and diverse political, economic, and military interests. And Churchill would have agreed with him, probably wrote and told him so. As Churchill told Lord Allenbrook, his chief military advisor, in April 1945, close to the end of the war in Europe, there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. And I think it gets at the difficulties of coalition warfare, the constant need to look after the alliance, the constant need to deal with the very different interests that alliance partners will have, often the repeated suspicions that people in alliances have with each other. I mean, you think of this extraordinary and very odd combination of allies in the Second World War, Great Britain, the United States, whose relations had been up and down for a couple of centuries and had not been good in the 1920s and 1930s. There was a lot of bad feeling left over in both countries as a result of international relations in the decades between the wars. And then, of course, you had the Soviet Union, which Churchill had wanted to intervene in 1919 and years immediately after to stop the Bolsheviks taking over. He described them as blood-stained, hairy baboons. And this was not something that the Soviets, for obvious reasons, had forgotten. And you have a Soviet Union which had a worldview, and you see it, particularly, of course, in its leader, Stalin, but I think it permeated the whole of the Soviet establishment and many of the Soviet people. A suspicion of the capitalist powers, a conviction that they would always be enemies, that there would never be a way of dealing with them. And these three are thrown together thanks to Hitler and the Japanese militarists. So looking at how this alliance survived and managed bring the war to a successful conclusion, I think, tells us a lot about the history of the Second World War, a lot about the history of those involved in making sure that that alliance worked. It also tells us something about alliances themselves. And I think this is important at the moment, at a time when we are seeing the formations of new alliances. Will there be a new alliance, the authoritarian alliance, which some people are talking about? Will we really see North Korea, Iran, Putin's Russia, possibly China forming some sort of alliance? Who knows? But clearly we are at a time in the world where alliances we took for granted or didn't expect to occur are shifting. And I think there's a certain amount of concern and worry about whether NATO and the Western alliance more generally will survive. A lot will depend on what happens, of course, in domestic politics. So we, I think, are at a time when we're looking at, again, alliances and how they work. There are different interpretations of what alliances mean. And political scientists tend to take a very functional view that an alliance is to maximize force against a common enemy. And much to the irritation of political scientists, historians tend to take a much messier and broader view, as we usually do. Historians, I think, see alliances, yes, as groups, nations, groups of people coming together in a common cause to fight a common enemy. But I think we also, historians, see them as being mechanisms of control. Countries often form alliances with smaller powers, partly in order to control them. Germany formed its alliance with Austria-Hungary in the years before the First World War, at least in part to stop Austria-Hungary from doing something really stupid in the Balkans. In the end, it wasn't able to do so, and the First World War broke out. But sometimes alliances are formed to try and keep an unruly possible partner or an unruly power under control. It doesn't always work. We've seen, and we are seeing again today, the ways in which the weaker partner of the alliance can often pull the alliance in the direction it wants. I mean, I think we're seeing it with Israel and the United States, with Netanyahu's government and the Biden government in Washington. For all the extraordinary amount of support that the United States gives Israel and has given Israel, it seems that the power to persuade Israel to do what the United States wants simply isn't there. There's a very good, I don't know if you've read it, there's a very good column by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times today, which points this out, that the United States is having real trouble in impressing upon Israel anything that the United States might think is a sensible thing to do. I think alliances can also do more than just deal with wars or the end of wars. They can also, and I think we've seen this with NATO and again, more broadly, the Western alliance, we've seen how alliances can help to promote shared values, not always successfully, but it seems to me that the most successful alliances depend not just on naked self-interest, but they also depend on shared values, shared visions of the world, sharing a possibility that the world can be a different place, that we can get together and build new international orders and new sorts of institutions. Making alliances work is not something that is easy, and anyone who's been a diplomat will know how tricky it can be. I mean, you can sign a treaty, you can make an agreement, but that's only the beginning of the story. Alliances, like any sort of relationships, need constant reinvention, constant reinvigoration, constant management. It's often very difficult to overcome the past. When the British and the French came together before the First World War, they had, after all, been in the Entente Cordiale, they had been enemies for some 300 years or more. And those suspicions which had built up over the past centuries of competition, war around the world, had not disappeared. All the way during the First World War, you would get French soldiers saying the British want to fight to the last Frenchman. And you get the British saying the French are lazy. And you get the French saying British can't make good coffee. They eat too much beef. And you get, even these small things. But there was, I think, you get it more and more. And of course, what you got towards the end of the First World War was rivalries in the Middle East as they scrambled to carve up the Ottoman Empire. You saw the same thing very much in the Second World War. Suspicions that came from the past, suspicions of Churchill in particular on the part of the Soviets. Churchill, as I said, had been so identified with Western intervention in Russia in the Russian Civil War, so identified with hostility to Bolshevism, that it was very difficult, understandably, for the Soviets to forget this, and very difficult, I think, for the Allies, for the United States and Britain, to forget that the Soviet Union had made a treaty with Hitler to carve up Poland and the center of Europe, and had sat out the first two years of the war. And so overcoming the past and trying to make a reasonable relationship, I think, was extremely important. Why do some work and others don't? I think we can all have our own views on this. I think clearly the size of the threat matters, the extent of the threat. If it's an existential threat, then you are forced into an alliance because you really have no alternative. The extent of the shared goals. But I think also important is the shallowness or the depth of the cooperation between the different alliance partners. What is clearly, I think, different about the relationship between the British and the Americans on one hand in the Second World War and the relationship between Britain and the United States with the Soviet Union is that in the first case, that relationship was very deep indeed. The British and Americans may have carped about each other, they may have been rude about each other, they often were, but they had a huge number of personal contacts. By the end, there was something well over 10,000 British people working in Washington, working with their opposite numbers. And those relationships, some of them were critical. Sir John Dill, who was sent as chief military advisor to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington, established a friendship with General Marshall, which was deep and lasting and very, very important. Marshall listened to him, and Dill played a very important function in passing on to the British things that the Americans were worried about, things the Americans were thinking, and played a very important role the other way around, reassuring the Americans that the British were not up to something devious. There's a wonderful extract, and I wish I can't remember exactly how it goes, written by a British officer in Washington, not Dill. And he said, the Americans are so convinced that we're devious and very tricky that when we do something really stupid, they spend a lot of time to figure out why we're doing it. And I do think these deep sort of suspicions, but people like Dill and this whole network of relationships. And then, of course, you had well over 1 million American soldiers, as well as advisors, economic advisors, diplomatic advisors in Britain. And so that nature of that relationship was very deep. And I think, of course, there were tensions, but I think it was very important that it was so extensive. There was never a relationship like that with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had deep suspicion of foreigners. They looked at the world through the lenses of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. And what they thought they saw was the capitalist powers, which sooner or later would come together to try and destroy them. They did not believe that the capitalists had good intentions ever. They believed that the capitalists would fight temporarily with them to defeat the Nazis and their allies, but they believed in the end that their long-term enemies were going to be the capitalists. What they hoped for, and Stalin seems to have believed this, they hoped that in the years immediately after the end of the war, the capitalists would be so busy recovering that they wouldn't have, at that point, the will or the capacity to invade or attack the Soviet Union, that they would, in fact, need to lend. There was this belief in the Soviet Russia that the capitalists would need to invest around the world to avoid a depression such as they'd had at the end of the First World War. And so there was this hope that the capitalists would pour vast amounts of money into the Soviet Union. Once the capitalists had recovered, they would then fight each other. That was to be expected. Whichever capitalist power came out supreme, whether Britain and the British Empire or the United States, then again, after some interval, that capitalist power would try and destroy the Soviet Union. So the Soviets had a vision of the way the world was going to be, and they had deep suspicion of the capitalist powers. They were prepared to work with them, but they weren't prepared to tolerate them. And the relationship was very different. There was never any of the depth and extensiveness that you got in the relationship between the British and the Americans. Foreign ambassadors in Moscow very rarely got to see top Soviet officials. In 1939, someone called Lawrence Steinhardt was appointed by Roosevelt as his ambassador in Moscow. And Steinhardt invited Molotov to come to lunch. Molotov, the foreign minister, Georgy Molotov, the foreign minister. It took Molotov 5 months to reply. This was not a friendly relationship. And American diplomats and British diplomats complained constantly that they had a great deal of trouble in getting to see their Soviet counterparts. When the military came through Moscow, they had a great deal of trouble in trying to find out what it was the Soviets were planning. The Soviets would tell them what they wanted. They'd give them lists of equipment they wanted, but they would never tell them why they wanted it or how they intended to use it. And I think every diplomat working in Moscow knew that they were followed the whole time, that they were probably being eavesdropped upon. They could not travel freely around the Soviet Union. And when foreign servicemen, British and American servicemen, came to Moscow, came to Russia in the course of the Soviet Union, in the course of the Second World War. For example, sailors coming into the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel and into Vladivostok, or the airmen who had the misfortune to be stationed on those few, I think it was about 4 airfields that the Soviets allowed to be built in Ukraine, on the assumption that these airfields could be used to bomb Germany from the east. It never happened. They were constantly surrounded. They were constantly monitored. Any unfortunate Russian woman who went out with them found herself being interrogated by the secret police, found herself often sent into exile. So the contacts, the sort of contacts that you had between the British people and American military here just did not exist in the Soviet Union. And so it was very difficult for Western powers to have any sense of what was going on in the Soviet Union. And very difficult, actually, we now know, for the Soviet Union to have any sense, of what was going on in the rest of the world. I mean, they were handicapped, I think, by the lenses with which they looked through the rest of the world. But they're also handicapped because the few Soviet diplomats who did know about the Western world had been called home. Maisky was called home in 1942. Litvinov, who knew a great deal about Europe, was sidelined in the foreign ministers. Others were purged and disappeared, never to be heard of again. And so the sources of information that the Soviets had about their alliance partners were limited, very largely because of their own making. And they had very little, occasionally, if you were a very privileged diplomat, you were allowed, to read such dangerous Western periodicals as Time magazine. But you had to sign it out, you had to be very, very careful what you said. And so it's a very different sort of relationship. Sorry, I think it's thank you very much. It's not that I'm moved to tears by the fate of Soviet diplomats, but thank you so much, Mitchell. So what you have, as I say, this is very, very different sort of relationship. Thanks, I'm fine. Very important as much as possible to try and manage it. And this is where I think the leadership comes in, because it's not everything. I mean, I think we know that. And leaders work with the institutions they have, they work with the subordinates they have, but often the leader can make a real difference. And I think so many of the big decisions were made by the big 3 leaders. They had enormous power. Stalin in the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States, and Winston Churchill in the UK. The latter 2 always had to contend with domestic politics in a way that the Soviets never really comprehended. At one point, I think it was at Yalta, one of the Americans said to Molotov, look, you have to, and Roosevelt certainly made this point to Stalin, but an American said to Molotov, you have to understand that American public opinion will look very unfavorably if we don't try and maintain the independence of Poland. And the Soviet diplomat looked absolutely stunned and said, well, then you must discipline your public opinion. You know, you're dealing with mutual incomprehension here. But even though Roosevelt and Churchill were democratic leaders, constantly having to pay attention to parliament and to public opinion, they nevertheless had an inordinate amount of influence, and they were to be enormously important. In their decisions, they were very, very important indeed. They often drove their diplomats crazy by not paying attention to what they were saying. Sometimes they did back down, but I think we have to understand that this relationship is very important. It's not everything. And the relationship involves history, it involves institutions, it involves peoples. But I think it is very important to look at the 3. And both Roosevelt and Churchill made very determined efforts to try and build a relationship with Stalin. If you look at the correspondence that went once the Soviets had come into the war after Hitler attacked in the summer of 1942, if you look at the correspondence, both Roosevelt and Churchill, as David Reynolds has shown so well in the book he's edited on their correspondence, took inordinate pains with how they wrote to Stalin. What appear as spontaneous communications are not. Every word was calculated, and a great deal of discussion. How do we appeal to Stalin? How do we get through to him? How do we try and reassure him that we want to be his friend, that we want to help him? How do we try and reassure him? Because they knew this was the case, that Stalin doesn't think that we will bear the brunt, the Soviet Union will bear the brunt of the fighting, that the Western powers want to see the Soviet Union exhausted by fighting Germany. And so this correspondence and the personal meetings were enormously important. Roosevelt, I think, depended on his famed charm to try and win Stalin over, and tried to get through to him, hinted at the possibility of a separate meeting without Churchill. And when Churchill found out about this, Churchill was in fact hurt and annoyed. Roosevelt said, well, it was just an attempt to just have an informal meeting. I think the suggestion was they might meet in Alaska, which never happened. Churchill, I think, tried to appeal to Stalin more as a fellow European statesman and tried to understand what it was that the Soviets might want and tried to speak to Stalin in those terms. But he too found it very difficult to get through to him. Roosevelt, I think, never really succeeded in winning over Stalin. I'm not sure anyone could have done. And Stalin was not called the man of steel for nothing and had very few human relationships at all. And Churchill, I think, possibly made more impact on Stalin, partly because he talked as Stalin expected a capitalist would talk, naked self-interest, whereas Roosevelt would talk in a sort of way about building the United Nations, a new sort of world order, and Stalin was deeply suspicious of that. Churchill tried to, for a certain period of time, tried to deal with what he saw as the inconsistencies and often the brutalities in Stalin's responses and the difficulties of dealing with Stalin by developing a theory, which I think he eventually came to abandon, that there were actually two Stalins. There was a good Stalin and a bad Stalin. And on some days, the good Stalin had the upper hand, and other days it was the bad Stalin. And both Roosevelt and Churchill thought that when Stalin did something, or they tried to explain it away, when Stalin did something particularly egregious, they explained it away by saying it's the people around him. He's been pressured by his own advisors. I mean, he's been told what to say. You know, it's the generals or it's Molotov. Of course, the more we know about Soviet politics, the idea that anyone would tell Stalin what to say, unless they wanted a very quick trip to the basement of the KGB building in Moscow, unless they wanted a very quick trip to the Gulag, is nonsense. But it was an attempt to try and understand and work with someone. So I'm going to say something now about Churchill, because I think his role, particularly in the early years of the war, is a very important one indeed. We know that he had great strengths as a war leader, and I think we're also well aware of his deficiencies. Some of his decisions were not good. Sometimes he overruled his advisors. Sometimes he wanted to do things that were not practical. But he always focused, and I think this is perhaps one of his greatest strengths, he always focused on maintaining the alliance with the Soviet Union and the United States. He recognized that whatever he did and whatever Britain did, this alliance was absolutely critical to the survival of Britain. The alliance with the United States was one that he had been working on since he became First Sea Lord at the beginning of went back to the Navy at the beginning of the Second World War. And he, very early on, Roosevelt wrote to him first to congratulate him on his new post, and Churchill started a correspondence which he took great care with. And this correspondence was a way of breaking through or establishing a relationship with someone he didn't think he had ever met. In fact, he had met him, and you probably know the story. This was slightly awkward. He'd met him. Roosevelt had come as a young assistant secretary of the Navy to London in 1919. I think it was 1919, and had met Churchill at that point, was back in the government. And Churchill apparently had been rather dismissive and haughty towards him, and Roosevelt had disliked him enormously. When the two men met at the Atlantic Conference off Newfoundland in August 1941, Churchill said, "It is such a pleasure to meet you for the first time." And Roosevelt said, "We've met before." It was not a happy, well, Churchill had forgotten it totally, but there was that little incident to overcome. But I think the assets that Churchill brought to managing this relationship, of course, was his own personal charm, his own great eloquence, his own capacity to be amusing, his own capacity to do these great, the first time they met, or at least the time they both remembered they'd met off Newfoundland, the first evening, Roosevelt asked Churchill to give a strategic analysis of what was happening, and people apparently were held spellbound. And he talked lucidly for over an hour about the state of the world, the state of the war. And I think Roosevelt appreciated that enormously. I think in time he possibly came to resent it. I suspect in the attitude of Roosevelt to Churchill, there was always a certain amount of resentment. It may have come out at Yalta. At least one of his advisors said that Roosevelt was dismissive of Churchill. So there may have been, as there often is with great men, a certain amount of rivalry there. But I think Churchill had this great capacity to talk in this extraordinary way. He also had a great understanding of history, which I think helped to inform his attitude both to the war and to the peace to come, and also to inform his attitude towards the alliance itself. He had, of course, written the biography of the great Duke of Marlborough. And one of the great things that the Duke of Marlborough had done in the War of the Spanish Succession was he'd kept a coalition together. He had worked with Prince Eugen of Savoy, among other things. And so I think Churchill was very much aware of just how much work has to go in to create a good and successful alliance. And he also had assets in dealing with Americans in public opinion. He made a great deal of the fact that his mother was American. When he first addressed Congress, he said, you know, but for a fate of my birth, I could have been standing here as one of your elected members. And he did pull on that American side of him. He was very good at his radio broadcasts. They were listened to in the United States and helped to get a very favorable impression of Britain. And he developed good relations with some of Roosevelt's key advisors, in particular Harry Hopkins, who was very close to Roosevelt, at least until 1945. His disadvantages were, of course, that Stalin was never going to trust him. He would work with him, but because of the past and because of Stalin's own biases, he wasn't going to trust him. He was not always trusted by Americans. He was seen as coming from the British elite, and there were a lot of Americans who thought that the British were effete and snobbish and that Churchill represented that. There was also a fear among the US military and some in the State Department that they daren't leave Roosevelt alone with Churchill because Churchill might persuade him to do something that wouldn't be in the interests of the United States. And so there were obstacles to overcome, but I think he worked very, very hard on this relationship. He called himself a wooer. He said, I'm wooing President Roosevelt, and it was absolutely essential for the survival of Britain. Of course, Churchill wanted the United States to come into the war, and there he met a Roosevelt who was not going to be moved. Roosevelt went a very long way to providing support for Britain in the first 2 years before the United States came in, but he was always very careful not to go too far ahead of public opinion. He had a sensitive grasp on public opinion. It was the early days of Gallup polls, and he read them religiously. He was always very conscious of what was going on. He'd gone once or twice in the 1930s ahead of public opinion. He wasn't going to do it again. And so while he expanded and used, and some would say abused, the powers of his office to give as much aid as possible to the British, he was not going to declare war before he was ready to do it or before he felt the American public was ready to do it. In fact, it's not clear that Roosevelt would have come into the war and that he would have felt that the American public was ready for a war in Europe if it hadn't been for Hitler. After Pearl Harbor, as you know, Germany declared war on the United States. And so all the questions and the hesitations were simply gone. And it was decided by the top military and by Churchill and Roosevelt that they would concentrate on Europe first, and they'd fight as much as possible a defensive war in Asia. The relationship develops very, very fast as a result of what happens in 1941. It doesn't mean some of the old suspicions disappear, but the relationship, I think, between Churchill and Roosevelt is probably at its strongest in 1942 through into 1943. It's a time when both countries are more or less equal, and that's going to disappear. The United States is gearing up for war, and it's this tremendous capacity. By 1944, 60% of all the Allied war material, including that of Russia, was being produced in the United States. And so you can see during the war, Britain becomes less and less powerful. Excuse me. The Soviet Union is never going to be a great economic power, but what it is going to be is a great ground military power. And so bit by bit, year by year, Britain, and Churchill is very much aware of this. He fights against it, but he's very much aware that Britain is now becoming the junior partner. And I think the time this is really shown, and I think in a way it's a conference that isn't paid enough attention to, and that is Tehran. It's the first conference which all three met at. Churchill and Roosevelt, of course, had met now extensively before 1943. Roosevelt had tried to get a private sort of informal meeting with Stalin, but that had not happened. But by 1943, by the end of 1943, they finally managed to find a time and a place to meet. Stalin would not travel far from the Soviet Union. I think his coming to Tehran was the first time he'd been outside Russia since before the First World War. His excuse always was that he had to stay near his generals. His generals, I think, would have preferred him to stay as far away as possible because his decisions were usually very bad. They met at Tehran, and I think it's actually the most interesting and the most important of the conferences because the three leaders were assessing each other. There was no agenda. FDR, Roosevelt, said he just wanted them to get to know each other. He said, why bother with a formal agenda? Which I think drove the British crazy, didn't bother Stalin because he knew what he wanted and he was quite prepared to watch Britain and the United States disagree with each other. Roosevelt refused to have any discussions with Churchill before Tehran. He said he didn't want to arouse Stalin's suspicions that they were ganging up on him. They were both in Cairo on their way to Tehran, but Roosevelt dodged any one-on-one discussions with Churchill. He simply didn't want to do it. He was determined to use his own very well-known charm. He had great confidence in his ability to win people over. He was determined to meet Stalin on his own without giving the appearance that he was in any sort of collusion with Churchill. In Tehran, he insisted on meeting Stalin, first of all, before he had lunch with Churchill, and he moved into the Soviet embassy. The American embassy was actually a bit further away. The Soviet and British embassies were very close in Tehran. And the Soviets came up with a story, which I think was probably completely fantasy, came up with a story that the Gestapo had dropped all sorts of German agents into Tehran who were going to come and assassinate Roosevelt. They never produced one of these German agents, but they said it's not safe for Roosevelt to stay at a distance in the American embassy and drive back and forth. And so Roosevelt, I think, actually welcomed this. He felt it was a way of showing Stalin that he trusted him. So he moved in to the Soviet embassy, which of course had been carefully prepared, including with bugs in the rooms. The son of Andrew Gromyko actually was quite surprised. He had helped to set up these bugs, and they'd listen to the conversations and they'd say to each other, do you think they know we're listening to them? Because the conversations were completely frank and often a bit rude about Stalin. But anyway, Roosevelt did what he could to reassure Stalin. He told Francis Perkins, who was his secretary for labor in his cabinet, he told her later, he said, I decided to rib Winston as a way of showing Roosevelt that I was on his side, showing Stalin that I was on his side. And so Churchill had, I think, a really unpleasant experience because Roosevelt kept on teasing him, kept on dropping remarks about how the British Empire isn't going to survive. We don't believe in empires, and knowing that this would get Stalin. And there was one very unfortunate dinner where Stalin talked about how they should just get a whole lot of German officers and shoot them. Now, whether he was joking or not, it's the sort of thing he was quite capable of, and also making a joke. And Elliot Roosevelt, who the rather ne'er-do-well son of Roosevelt, joined in and said, oh yes, we should do at least 60,000. And Churchill said, I can't believe we're saying this. We're a civilized people, and got very upset and actually left the room. This was, I think, very deliberate on the part of Roosevelt, at least the father, to try and establish this relationship with Stalin. Now, a number of things came up at Tehran which foreshadowed what was going to happen later. One of the things that Churchill had resisted, I think wisely and understandably, was opening a second front on the continent of Europe too early. He knew what that would cost. The few attempts to have raids onto the coast of Europe had been a disaster, particularly Dieppe, had cost a number of lives and had achieved absolutely nothing. So that I think he understood the costs. And I think he was, like many of the European statesmen, haunted by the losses in the First World War. Stalin, however, put pressure on. He kept on saying, whatever you do in North Africa, which was, of course, being mooted, it's not the same thing as opening a second front. You must open a second front. It doesn't matter what happens to Italy. And Roosevelt supported him on this. And Churchill very reluctantly agreed to a second front, although he did his very best to postpone it as long as possible. There were discussions of Eastern Europe, and again, Churchill tried to get some understanding. I think he recognized that the state of the war was such that the Soviets were going to start rolling. It was clearly that the Soviets were now on the move, and they were going to start rolling westwards. And if they didn't get some agreement on the future of Europe, it was going to be very bad for the center of Europe and very bad indeed for the future of Europe. And Roosevelt, again, would not play along. His main goal was to try and establish trust with Stalin. And of course, he wanted to get Stalin and the Soviet Union into the war in the Far East. And so he left the impression, in spite of everything Churchill could do, and Churchill kept on trying to pin Stalin down and kept on trying to get Roosevelt involved in any decision, he effectively removed the United States from playing any part in Europe after the war. He said at Tehran, that the US would not keep troops in Europe after the war. And that was, I think, seen by the British as a clear signal to the Soviet Union they were going to have a relatively free hand. Churchill tried both then and later in the famous percentages agreement in Moscow to try and get a commitment from Stalin about at least having spheres of influence in the center of Europe, trying to get commitments on the future of Poland. At Tehran, in fact, had a discussion with Stalin where he talked about Poland's borders and tried to get some sort of commitment from Stalin. But the United States simply would not play along. This was something that Roosevelt seemed to think would sort itself out. And I think Churchill came away from Tehran recognizing that Britain was no longer the power that it had been. It was nothing he could do about. It was not something he could do anything about. But I think he did his best to try and keep Britain in the discussions. But he was dealing with a Roosevelt who was getting old, sick, dealing with a Stalin who was obdurate and knew exactly what he wanted, and dealing with a situation which, as I said, Britain was no longer as powerful as it had been in 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942. The Soviet Union was now, had millions of people in Europe. The United States was now hugely powerful, and American forces both in the Pacific and moving into Britain and into North Africa. And so this was, I think, both a victory for Churchill. He had helped to create the Grand Alliance. He had helped to work with both Roosevelt and for the benefit of Britain, and certainly American help in the early stages of the war against Germany. It helped, especially after the fall of France, it helped to keep Britain in the war. It had been absolutely critical. The basis for destroyers agreement early on, which provided some destroyers for the British, which were badly needed, but also I think was important for British morale. And then, of course, Lend-Lease, which was hugely important. Without that, I think the British could not have stayed in the war. And so what the Americans did was very important, but increasingly the Americans were in a position where they could dictate what was done and they could dictate the terms. And so as the war begins to wind down, we see Churchill trying very, very hard to salvage something. The percentages agreement where he goes off to Moscow, you know, this perhaps infamous agreement where he and Stalin meet and they scribble on, Churchill scribbles on an envelope and says, okay, let's say you have 90% influence in Poland, we have, 90% influence in Greece. The percentages varied a little bit. And it was Churchill's attempt. He was much criticized for it later, but I think it was an understandable attempt made by Churchill to try and get some sort of commitment that might at least keep the Soviet Union from dominating the whole of Europe. And he was not getting support from the Americans on this. The Americans were focused on building a new world order. They were also focused on what was going on in the Pacific. And you see, I think, an increasingly desperate Churchill trying to salvage something, both for Britain, but I think also for Europe, as the war winds towards an end. And of course, Yalta, again, is more of the same. I mean, Tehran, Churchill was still something of an equal. By the time he got to Yalta, he was not. And of course, I think it was also, both Roosevelt and Churchill were tired. Roosevelt was going to die very soon after Yalta. Churchill's health was not what it had been. And the Soviets simply got their own way. I've always thought that to blame the decisions at Yalta for handing over Europe to the Soviet Union is not fair. The Soviet forces were already on the ground. I think Churchill recognized the situation, recognized the truth of it, made a plea to Stalin. Stalin did sign the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which he had no intention of maintaining. Churchill made this rather tragic plea, I think, to Stalin to let the small birds sing. But Stalin was not prepared to let small birds sing. And there was really not much that Churchill could do about this point. And so the war comes to an end in 1945. Soviets are stunned by the election results in Britain. Again, this is, I think, shows the Soviet incomprehension of how democratic politics work. Churchill came to Potsdam, as did the new president of the United States, Truman, and of course went back to England to hear the election results and was out. And Stalin apparently was completely disbelieving. He couldn't understand how this had been so mismanaged. If this had happened in the Soviet Union, heads would have rolled. But Churchill was out, and Stalin found himself dealing with a new government. Now, could anyone have prevented what was then going to happen? The war came to an end in Europe in the spring of 1945, was going to come to an end in the Far East by August 1945. And you can see in that period, the beginnings of the Cold War beginning to take shape, you can probably go further back and see the roots of that Cold War, which was going to happen. Could Churchill have made a difference? Could Roosevelt have made a difference if they'd survived? Could they have somehow persuaded Stalin that his best interests were working with them, as they had managed to persuade France at the Congress of Vienna, that its best interest was to work with them and the other powers? Could Churchill have somehow managed to keep the Grand Alliance going? Could it have produced the equivalent of the Concert of Europe, which did manage, for better or worse, but often for better, affairs in Europe, at least in the first half of the 19th century, so that there was stability and security? It was a conservative alliance, but it did provide the stability in Europe. Could that have happened? Or were the differences too great? And was a Cold War and perhaps even a hot war in the cards? So I'm going to leave those questions with you. I can't answer them. Thank you. Sorry, Anita.
We have some time for questions for Professor MacMillan, and I will let her choose among you.
You have, yes.
Thank you, John Scarlett. Obviously, the fundamental point there is a relationship between the US and Britain.
Yeah.
And you referred to the difference which have been there in the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah.
And the implication was, well, it took time.
Yeah.
Once the war was underway and the fighting together
Yeah.
and so on was underway, for it to develop in the way you described. But how do you explain that the way it started? I mean, before America joined the war in February 1941,
Yeah.
They met at Bletchley Park.
Yeah.
The cyber people
Yeah.
in celebrations in Britain and America, and they exchanged their fundamental business secrets.
Yeah.
And there was no treaty
Yeah.
between the two countries.
Mm.
There was, if you like, some difficulties in the relationship
Yeah.
that you talked about, and yet there was still some fundamental
Yeah.
point of trust and mutual
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah.
How do you explain that, and what does it add, if anything, to what you've been saying?
No, it is interesting because it's so easy to think of the things that ran against the relationship. And there was a lot of bad feeling left over from the 20s and 30s. You know, the complaints that the British hadn't paid their war debts, complaints that the British hadn't supported the Americans in Manchuria. And these ran deep. I think a couple of things. I mean, I think, and also in some of the US military, I mean, some of the US military, certainly the Army, had been making plans in peacetime where Britain would be one of their main enemies. And well, we also had the naval confrontation at the Paris Peace Conference. But I think it was partly Roosevelt. When he wanted to, he bypassed. I mean, his administration was chaotic in many ways and drove many people who worked for him crazy, but he could bypass people. And he bypassed the State Department or only relied on those who he knew would be sympathetic to Britain. But a lot of things were run out of the White House. He dealt with his military. They didn't have the influence that the British military had. And I think that was important. I mean, there were people in the US military who saw Britain as a primary enemy, but they were sidelined and marginalized. And I think you also had a very strong East Coast establishment around the Council of Foreign Relations, which saw American interests as not letting Europe be dominated by Nazi Germany and its allies. And so I think Roosevelt maneuvered through, which he was very good at. And I think he also, as I think I mentioned, he expanded, or some people would say abused the powers of his presidency. You know, the exchange of intelligence, which was completely unofficial, but was very extensive. And you had, even before in 1940 and 1941, you had staff talks, extensive staff talks about what a war would look like if the United States came in. And Roosevelt also expanded the naval patrols in the Atlantic, and in fact expanded the defensive perimeter that he declared around the waters around. So I think it was Roosevelt. I mean, there are still those today who would say that Roosevelt illegitimately got the United States into the war. And those were accusations at the time. But I think he allowed the relationship to develop. And I think there were enough people on both sides who saw just how important it was. And both diplomats, I think very important, I think Lord Halifax, who was sent off to the United States, actually became a very important part of this relationship. There was this unfortunate incident at the beginning when he went to a baseball game and didn't eat his hot dog. And this was reported in all the American press. American British ambassador hates American hot dogs. But it did, I think, develop. And I think there were enough people on both sides who wanted to work with each other. And you often got this phenomenon, which I think you do get, where armed forces, the different branches of the armed forces, spend more time fighting each other and often establish a friendship. The British and American Air Forces established a very good relationship because they both had great faith in the bomber. And so that was, I think, a very important relationship. The Navy got on. The Navy's got on quite well. It was the armies that didn't get on as well. But then you got people like Eisenhower, who was determined that the relationship would work. And so I think it was a number of things, but I do think Roosevelt deserves a great deal of credit for this. He allowed it to happen. And a lot of stuff, I mean, he did it in devious ways, certainly. And a lot of stuff went through Canada, which of course was a combatant. And so there are stories of American planes being made in the Midwest and shipped in pieces, quite often rolled down the streets of little towns on the border, shipped into Canada in pieces and then put together there. And so Roosevelt could deny that he was sending airplanes to the United States, to Great Britain, but they were actually getting there. And he talked of ways, I mean, he often had sort of absurd ideas, but he talked of ways of getting equipment to Britain without the American public learning about it. So I think he deserves, I mean, I think he really deserves a lot of the credit for this. And of course, there's always Churchill writing these impassioned letters about how they have got to get some more equipment, which was true. I mean, he wasn't just saying it. If they didn't get equipment, they couldn't hang on. And I think what also began to shift American, sorry, this is rather a long answer, but what began to shift American opinion was when the American observers, key observers, plus the American public became convinced that Britain would hang on. The summer of 1940 was really crucial, because when France fell, I think a lot of people thought that's it. There's no way Britain can fight on, or maybe it doesn't even want to fight on. And I think Churchill was not just important for the British people, but hugely important for the United States, because he made it absolutely clear that there wouldn't be a surrender. And the fact that Britain survived the Blitz, I think, was very important indeed. So you get a real shift of opinion in the United States, but right at the core of it is Roosevelt, this bewildering and complicated figure who allows things to happen. Okay. The gentleman at the back. Oh, sorry, there are two gentlemen at the back. Okay.
John Grant, United Kingdom Defence Force. I've worked in Ukraine at the time. I've seen further horrible reception.
Sorry, you'll have to speak up a little bit, please.
The lack of historical knowledge of too many people.
Yeah.
To be fair, the European Union.
Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, you made the point about people growing. Who were the key players behind Church in raising awareness or concerns about the social before the incident? And who perhaps were the key players in Truman, Roosevelt, Truman on the reaction between May and August?
Yeah.
Not one man band.
No. Yeah. But I think with Churchill, he did understand the Soviet Union. He had his views very clearly on the Soviet Union, but he didn't listen to Sir Stafford Cripps. In fact, he sent him to Moscow to get him out of the way, I think, because Cripps was a potential political rival. But he did speak to Cripps when he came back, and he did pay attention to some of the British who'd been there. But the sources of information on the Soviet Union were so limited. But I think Churchill, with his great sense of history, did really understand and understood he had this wonderful phrase about the Soviet, or Russia rather. Russia is never as weak as it seems, or as strong. And he knew that, he saw Stalin in some ways, both as an ideologue, but as a Russian imperialist, which I think was actually seeing him very, very accurately. So I think he had a very good ambassador eventually in Moscow, whose name I now, of course, forget. Someone will remember. He'd been in China before. So he did have some good people there, but their game was so limited. And they couldn't go out and meet Russians. They didn't meet Russian academics. They didn't meet ordinary people. They just couldn't. Nobody wanted to speak to them. And it was very difficult indeed. But I think really Churchill probably had made up his mind about the Soviet Union. I mean, he loathed Bolshevism and everything it stood for. And I think feared what would happen once the war was ended. Sorry, yes, the other gentleman. I'm sure everyone's a gentleman, but I
don't sort of not the dumb thing for alternative historic lines, but you talked about the strength of the lines and all the rest. But is there a plausible scenario where the alliance, the Grand Alliance, would have just fallen apart and can't deal with it?
Yeah, I think there is. It could have fallen apart. I mean, if the United States hadn't come into the war in Europe, which was not a foregone conclusion, you know, Pearl Harbor brought it into the war against Japan, but a lot of Americans had no interest in the war in Europe. I mean, the polls showed that very clearly. I mean, they were shifting in favor of an American involvement in Europe. They would like to see the United States support Britain, but they didn't want American soldiers fighting there. And really, in a way, Hitler made the Grand Alliance, or helped to form the Grand Alliance, by declaring war on the United States, which he didn't have to do under the terms of his agreement with Japan. But he felt that Germany was going to have to fight the United States eventually anyway, and he thought I might as well just get it over with and declare war. So I think, yes, that could have been very different. Without American presence in Europe, more of Europe, I think, would have fallen to the Soviets. I mean, there was not much to stop them, you know, between the Soviet Union and the Channel. I mean, distance, logistics, all of this would begin to make a difference. But I think Britain could have been left much more isolated if the US hadn't come into the war. And it was always the possibility. Stalin always feared that Britain and the United States would make a separate peace. He was much more likely to do it. The British and the Americans made it very clear there would be no separate peace. And at Casablanca, they talked about unconditional surrender, which was partly designed to reassure the Soviets that they weren't going to carry the war right through to the end. But we now know that Stalin, through intermediaries in Sweden, for example, was you know, putting out feelers. I think he would have done a deal. Well, he'd done a deal with Hitler in 1939. I think he might well have done it again. And so it could have fallen apart over that as well. Yes.
My question is, do you think the Roosevelt administration was perhaps overly aggressive towards Britain on the economic front? People like Hull and Wells, people was thrown over on imperial preference, the Ottawa
Agreements,
regime, and going through, and obviously their views on British imperialism, European imperialisms in general. How that manifested itself later.
No, a lot of Americans had strong views on this. For a while, in the early days of the war, when the Americans were beginning to give support to Britain, there was this conviction in Washington, the British were sitting on piles of gold and had much more money than they were letting on. And there was a very unfortunate incident where the British had sent some of their gold reserves to South Africa, safekeeping, and the Americans had effectively seized them and said, we'll take care of that shipload for you, and taken it off to Washington. And so there were there were these tensions. And certainly the fact that Churchill was such a vehement defender of the British Empire, far more than most people in his cabinet, but that Americans tended to think that Churchill stood for all British in positions of authority. The British were firmly committed to the empire. I don't think they really fully understood that the Labour Party was not. And that there were those in the Tory party as well who thought that the empire was going to have to change, that India was going to have to become independent. And there was talk of this during the war, and it might have moved further along if certain things had gone differently. So I think a lot of Americans were suspicious of the British, but partly because Churchill was in charge, they tended to assume that he spoke for a unified British opinion, which was not true. And yes, I think the Americans were, and there was a terrible shock at the end of the war, after the Potsdam Conference, when the war against Japan ended, and Truman suddenly canceled Lend-Lease at 2 days' notice. And the British were absolutely shattered because they were counting on it to continue to help them rebuild. And so, yes, and I think the Americans like the Soviet Union, tended to overestimate how strong Britain was. I mean, we can look back and say, you know, Britain was much weaker by 1945, but that's not how it appeared to either the Soviet Union or the Americans. And I think there were always these suspicions in Washington and elsewhere that the British were holding out on them. Sorry, does it? Oh,
One more last question.
well, there's a very patient lady at the back.
Question.
May I? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh,
my question is, or my comment, if you like, is about who decided about going to Malta. Because Malta was threatened in the war. We all know what happened to Malta. And Malta was starved out of everything during the war.
yeah. This was on the way to Yalta. In fact, Churchill made up a little rhyme from Malta to Yalta. Well, I can't remember how it goes. We can't do it quicker or something. Does anyone remember? I forget it. But Malta was just a convenient place to stop. And I think Churchill was still hoping at that point that Roosevelt, who was coming and making part of the trip by American ship, would come in and they'd be able to have a quiet talk. And Roosevelt, of course, as he had been at Tehran, was doing his best to avoid such a talk. So I think it was just a convenient stopping place. It was in pretty bad shape when the governor's house was, and Churchill complained that he couldn't have a decent hot bath. And I think went back to being on a ship. He felt it was more comfortable. And there wasn't much champagne around either in those days in Malta. So anyway, I'm sorry, but I thought we must have.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor MacMillan. And she'll be available to sign a copy of her latest book just outside.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I thought we had.